Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 2 of our Wii Retrospective. If you didn't check out the first episode, this is basically a series where I'm going through the Wii catalog. I'm going through my personal collection. I'm going through all the other notable games that are worth mentioning. Basically, now that the Switch is out and, we're putting away our Wii U's, which had the Wii backwards compatibility, I want to go through and give some credit to some of the games on the Wii that are worth checking out. There was a lot of garbage on the Wii, so it's important, I think, to remember some of the greater titles that came out. So let's dive right into it. We're going to kick off this time with the year 2008. The first title I want to mention I don't have here, but it's Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. And this is basically a Harvey Birdman game based on the Cartoon Network series where you play Harvey Birdman and, go through a couple different cases. It's got, animation that resembles the show. It's got the same kind of funny storylines. There's a couple of cases in it, I think maybe 4 or 5. It's created by Capcom, which is what makes it notable. It's built by, I think the same team that did the Ace Attorney games. And it kind of tried to follow that formula. It was really a shell of those games. It was really quick. It only took about 2 hours. There wasn't a whole lot of dialogue like the Ace Attorney games. It was mostly just quick clips like the cartoon series. And the gameplay wasn't quite as involved as Ace Attorney. But it was pretty fun, and for fans of the series, it's worth checking out. For, fans of Ace Attorney, it's worth seeing just to see how, they could take that kind of gameplay formula and apply it to something else. In this case, a notable cartoon. So that's definitely worth mentioning. The next game I want to mention is Endless Ocean, which I also don't have because I've been kind of trimming down my collection, so I'm trying to keep the games that are most notable to me. Endless Ocean, though, is a really cool game, and it's a underwater exploration game. It's a real slow-moving game. There's not a whole lot of action in it. It's basically a scuba diving game where you go and search for different, sea creatures and explore, sunken stuff, and it's a cool little game worth checking out. Which brings us to the first game in my collection worth mentioning. No More Heroes. Suda51's, I think maybe one of his most popular games. A big hit for the Wii, I think, in terms of hardcore gamers. You play Travis Touchdown, who's entered this tournament to see who is the best assassin. He's got to beat the other 10 assassins who are above him in order to claim that prize. It's got a twisted storyline. It's got all kinds of crazy ways it plays with the narrative. It's a real he's such a hardcore otaku. It's got a lot to say about, games and, that kind of culture. And it's just a really interesting beat 'em up. Worth checking out if you haven't yet. No More Heroes has a big open world that Travis can explore on his motorcycle. You can go to different shops. You can do different side jobs to earn money so that you can compete against the next rank match. And you can also do little side assassination missions to earn money. Next up is One Piece Unlimited Adventure. I'm not the biggest One Piece fan. I think I'm about 600 episodes behind the show right now, so I'm also, there's also quite a few One Piece games, but the one thread among them is almost every One Piece game that's ever come out over here has become crazy rare, and Unlimited Adventure is no exception. It is a pretty hard to find Wii game right now, and it's the first of a couple games in the Unlimited series. It's got your typical adventure gameplay. You run around, you collect items, you fight by. It's got your adventure mode where you follow through a storyline. The cruise ship has been taken, and so they're trying to find their missing ship. They're exploring a big island. They're fighting bad guys. It's that kind of stuff. It's got a fighting mode with 40 playable characters and 2-player versus. It's a cool game for One Piece fans. I think it's worth checking out. There were 2 sequels that never came out over here on the Wii, so it might leave you hanging a little bit. Next up, I want to mention Bomberman Land, which is Hudson's kind of take on the minigame formula that has been popping up so much on the Wii. Every Bomberman game is pretty notable because it's such a cool multiplayer thing. In this case, it's not your traditional Bomberman. I mean, some of those elements are there, but it's really more of a party game. So it's a weird outlier for the series. Next up, everyone was waiting for a Dragon Quest game. And so for the Wii, we got Dragon Quest Swords, The Masked Queen, and The Tower of Mirrors. And it is not the Dragon Quest game people were waiting for. It's not an RPG. It is an on-rails action game. And that's kind of hard to explain. It's kind of like a shooter, but set in a fantasy world. You use your sword to attack enemies who pop up around you. You can use your shield to block attacks. You can create new weapons. There's 16 stages, but you kind of have to replay them to grind and level up and get stronger so you can beat the later levels. It's interesting. It's not great, but it is definitely something interesting. Next up is Super Smash Brothers Brawl. Every game in the Smash Brothers series is pretty unique. This one, I think its big unique feature is the subspace adventure mode, where it becomes more of like a platformer, and you can play that co-op with two players, and you just go through the different stages, and you view this story mode of, the bad guys turning the good guys into trophies, and then you play different characters and go through the levels and try and free your friends. I think the game wasn't as well received as Melee. My personal problem is that it feels really floaty. Every character kind of feels like, just it doesn't have the precision that Melee had. It's got a huge cast of characters, which is really great. It's got crazy stuff like Snake from Metal Gear and Sonic, and it's something that was really fun at the time. I think the new Smash Brothers game that came out more recently for Wii U and the Melee is probably better to play, but it's still worth seeing the huge cast. It's worth checking out that adventure mode. We're going to talk about a lot of on-rail shooters for the Wii, but this was Sega's big one. House of the Dead 2 and 3 return. It's basically just House of the Dead 2 and 3. 2 came out for Dreamcast, 3 came out for Xbox, but this is both of them together. You can use the Wii Zapper, or you can just use the typical Wiimote for aiming, and it's just a cool collection to have both of those together. I wish one was on here, but the graphics are probably really dated. It's probably hard to port from the arcade or Saturn, I'm not sure. But, it's a nice collection regardless. House of the Dead is a cool series and worth, if you have to play rail shooters on the system, it's probably one of the better ones to check out. Next up, I want to talk about Castle of Shikigami 3, just because it's such a weird entry. It's not something I expect to find on the Wii. I mean, there are shooters on the Wii, but it's weird to see this kind of bullet hell shooter. It's a follow-up to Castle of Shikigami 2, which was released on the PS2. It's an anime-style vertical bullet hell shooter. There's 11 playable characters. There's 6 stages. There's not too much to say about it other than, you can bet this one will be rare in the future, and it's a strange kind of release. The next game I don't have because I kept the PS2 version instead, but Okami, which is a great little, Zelda-inspired game. Beautiful artwork. It's this big game that uses this brushstroke mechanic to play with that probably works really well on the Wiimote. The game didn't do well on PS2, so it's nice to see it get a second life here on the Wii. If you like games with beautiful art styles, it's something that's just really unique. Next up is Mario Kart Wii, and, actually a really good entry in the Mario Kart series. It shipped alongside a wheel controller, which I don't have anymore because I don't know if anyone actually used that. I think it was a cool control. Like it worked well for kids. You put your Wiimote in there and you could use the tilt controls to kind of control your car. It just made, boosting a little more difficult. So most people just play with the standard controller style. They toned down some of the things that were, critiqued in the old version, like snaking, which is, more difficult or maybe even impossible to do in this one. Yeah, it's Mario Kart. I don't know what else to say. Next up, another game I don't have, but Boom Blocks, which was really fun at the time. EA put it out. It was kind of co-designed by Steven Spielberg. It's this game where you shoot projectiles at towers of blocks and try and complete different objectives. Basically try and complete stages of these block towers. It's just a cool little puzzle game. It's worth checking out. It's fun to play with other people. It's just a fun time. Next up, Wii Fit, and one of the big games since Wii Sports to try and get that casual audience really into the Wii again. This thing came with a balance board that you stood on. It could, it was kind of like a scale that would measure your weight and your balance. It had a bunch of little daily activities, again, fulfilling that kind of Wii as a lifestyle machine idea. Let people get on there daily and check out how they're doing, give them different exercises and help work on their posture and balance, and gave them like an interactive trainer that would help them, as they try to lose weight. It's a cool little game about getting fit. Next up, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo's Dungeon. Maybe, I guess you could consider this Chocobo's Dungeon 3, following the PS1 Chocobo Dungeons games. It is a roguelike. It's basically a mystery dungeon game. You control Chocobo, you move one space at a time, and the enemies move around the same time. You explore dungeons, looking for items and trying to complete quests. It's got a really cool storybook presentation that the other games didn't have, kind of like a fairy tale. It's a really neat dungeon crawler. And, it's Final Fantasy, so Next up, two more games I don't have. First is Super Mario Sluggers, which is the baseball game starring Mario and crew. You know, Nintendo sports games are really fun. They're over the top. They take Nintendo power-ups and characters and put them into these sports, and they're always good times. And it's a follow-up to the GameCube Mario baseball game. Next is The Blob, which at the time was a really cool kind of platformer. You play this weird blob. You go out and pick up different colors, and then you try and paint the environments to complete the objectives. It's a cool little 3D puzzle platformer game. Next up, a game that I didn't ever hear anyone talk about too much, but I really dug it, which is Wario Land Shake It. This game is a follow-up to the other Wario Land games. So it's a 2D platformer where the goal is kind of to collect treasure throughout the levels. At the end of each level, you have to get out in a certain amount of time, so there's a cool little backtracking mechanic that really changes things up. It makes the end of every level kind of like a time trial. It is beautiful looking. There's an amazing art style behind it, hand-drawn stuff, which you don't really see much anymore. And I think the only game in the series that is on a console, right? I mean, there was a Wario game on the GameCube, but it was a 3D game. This is just a great follow-up to those portable titles. Next up is Lost in Blue Shipwrecked. I love the Lost in Blue series. It is the survival kid series from Japan. In mostly portable entries, there were 3 Lost in Blue games that came out on the DS. This is the only console version of Lost in Blue that I know about. It's this kind of, survival game where in this one you get shipwrecked on an island with your monkey buddy. You explore the area. You try and, stay warm, stay fed, stay, hydrated, and just explore the island and try and find a way off of it. The stories in these games usually get a bit more involved as you make discoveries on the island, but it's a cool series. I mean, this isn't the best game. Their first attempt at a console version isn't quite as good as the portable ones, but it is something worth checking out. Next up, another game I don't have here anymore, but Samba de Amigos, which was a cool port of the Dreamcast Maracas game that Sega put out. You basically could use the Wiimote and the nunchuck as a maracas. It didn't feel at all like the original controllers, but it worked all right. It had 2 times the amount of songs from the Dreamcast version, so there was that. It's a cool little rhythm game that worked pretty well with that control scheme. Next up is Harvest Moon Tree of Tranquility, which, it's a typical Harvest Moon game. I'm going to go through all the Harvest Moon games for these series because it's Michelle's favorite series, and so we have them all. So it's a traditional Harvest Moon game. You manage relationships, you work on your farm, you try and save the community. It's, the one thing that makes this one a little more special is it's the first one to have a New Game Plus where you can play as your kid. So there's this generational aspect to the game. Next up, another game I don't have here anymore, but Sam & Max Season 1. This was Telltale's first attempt to kind of revitalize a bunch of the LucasArts adventure games. The Sam & Max game was episodic. I think there were 5 or 6 episodes per season. They were fun and goofy and kind of tough. These seasons came out on other platforms, but this was the only physical release. And, the control scheme with the Wiimote really helped for a point-and-click adventure. So if you like, LucasArts adventure games and this isn't something that you've played, it's probably worth your time. Next up is Wii Music, which is a game that Nintendo heavily pushed one year at E3. This weird kind of conceptual music thing where, you could use the Wiimote as something like 60 different instruments. It was more freeform. It wasn't a rhythm game in the traditional sense. It was more about kind of being creative. There were 50 songs in it that you could make different arrangements for. There was a jam mode and 3 different mini games. It was really more of an educational piece than anything else, trying to make learning music a bit more fun and a bit more involved in your traditional rhythm games. I don't know anyone who really dug it, but it's strangely notable for how much hype Nintendo put behind it. Right after that, we got Star Wars: The Clone Wars Lightsaber Duels. And this is not a good game, but it is notable because ever since the Wiimote was announced, the one thing everyone wanted was a 1-to-1 lightsaber game. Something in the Star Wars universe let me swing that Wiimote like a lightsaber. And this is the game that gave it to us. And it's cool because it is the Clone Wars, which is a really cool series if you haven't checked it out and dig Star Wars. But the game it wasn't really there. Next up is Tales of Symphonia: Dawn of the New World, which is the only Tales game that came out over here on the Wii. It's a sequel or spin-off kind of the original Tales of Symphonia game from GameCube. A lot of the same characters are there. Events from the other game are mentioned. The combat has been completely changed, so unlike the Tales of Symphonia combat engine, it feels more like Destiny or Tales of the Abyss. it was cool for a while when it was an exclusive Tales game for the Wii. Now that the collection has come out for PS3, you can just play it on there. But for the time, this was really neat to have, even if it's considered not as good as Tales of Symphonia. Next up is Animal Crossing City Folk, which is a strange name for the game because it doesn't take place in the city, but rather it takes place in your traditional Animal Crossing small town, and you can take the bus into the city to do other things. It launched alongside the Wii Speak accessory, which was a microphone that you could use to talk to other gamers. I don't know if anything else ever used it. Nintendo was really tight about, keeping this family-friendly image of, you can't really communicate with other players, and so it was surprising that they even put this out. It had a weird new perspective too, where the world was a little more spherical, so it was, that was distracting to me personally. And I think this is kind of a point where Animal Crossing had kind of fallen off, even though there weren't many games in the series before it. People were kind of tired by the formula at this point, so I didn't hear many people talking about it. Next up is a game that everyone loves to hate. Castlevania Judgment. It is a fighting game, a 3D anime style fighting game with characters from all the different Castlevania games. They all kind of come together through this time warp and have to fight. It plays very much like a typical anime fighting game, like a Dragon Ball or a Naruto fighting game. The art is completely changed. It's cool looking art, but if you love the Castlevania series, it's almost blasphemy. It was all redesigned by the artist behind Death Note. Everything looks very Death Note-y, which looks nothing like the original characters. The characterizations have changed completely, which upset a lot of fans. But other than that, it is what it is, and it's worth noting just because it is such a weird beast. Well, that's it for 2008, and we're going to dive right into 2009, which is the most involved year for Wii releases. There was a ton of good stuff out this year. This was maybe the high point of the Wii, and we're kicking it off with a really great title, Fragile Dreams, Farewell Ruins of the Moon, which is it's hard to describe. It's kind of an action RPG. It feels a bit like a survival horror, but there's not really a horror element to it. It's really atmospheric. It's by Tricrescendo, who worked on Baten Kaitos for GameCube and the Eternal Sonata, which is an amazing looking game, which is kind of inspired by the Tales series. You play this boy who thinks he's the last human alive. It's this kind of beautiful landscape. It's apocalyptic, but not in like a Fallout desolate way. It's bright, colorful, really cool looking. The boy sees a girl and chases after her, trying to, find this other person in the world with him, and gets involved with, the spirits and trying to figure out what happened to the world and all this crazy stuff. And it's just a really cool atmospheric game for the Wii. Next up, another game I don't have here, but Deadly Creatures is a really cool game. I don't know how to describe it. I guess it's an adventure game. The game has you playing a snake and a spider, and you go through these stages, fighting other animals and insects. In some cases, there are humans in it who are antagonists who have their own storylines. They're trying to complete their own goals, and it's a really cool concept for a game that works really well. It's definitely worth checking out. Next up, another House of the Dead game. In this case, House of the Dead Overkill. This game is wicked. This game may be one of my favorite rail shooters on the system. It is inspired by the House of the Dead series. It uses the similar characters and bad guys, but it's a whole different alternate universe take on it, let's say. It's really Grindhouse inspired. It's edited like that. Just bad cuts, bad jokes. Just ridiculous. Everything is ridiculous in it, and it is crazy. I highly recommend you check it out. There's an updated version on the PS3 that uses the Move controllers, but even though those look better, I just feel like the Wiimotes are so easy to sync, and the setting up the Move to your PS3 is kind of a pain. So this is the version I choose to play. Well, I guess we're going to keep the zombie theme going for the next two games, because right after that is Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop. The original Dead Rising was a Capcom game exclusive to the 360, where I think it was close to a launch title and the first must-have game, in my opinion, for the 360. You're in a shopping mall that is full of zombies. You can run around picking up all kinds of items and stuff. It was really impressive, the amount of zombies on screen at a time. And for some reason, the Wii got this port of it that's just really scaled down. It does not look great. There's barely any zombies on screen at a time compared to the other version. It's just a bad port of the game all around. It's really only notable because it's such a strange thing that they brought over. Instead of trying to make something new and unique, they could have added a new little side story to the series. They just tried to port this one and it did not work. And right after that, we have Onchambara, or Onchambara, I'm not sure how you say it, Bikini Zombie Slayers. This game originally the series started as a simple 2000, I think, series in Japan, which are a series of budget titles for the PS1 and 2. This one came out alongside an Xbox 360 one, which are completely different games, but both have the same theme. You play girls in bikinis who fight zombies. It is budget. It doesn't feel well. It's mostly just notable for being crazy and weird. Right after that, we get Sonic and the Black Knight, which is the follow-up to Sonic and the Secret Rings. It's a very similar style, except now it's more of a medieval storybook instead of an Arabic one. There's better Sonic games now, but at the time it was a decent Sonic game, when we were getting a lot of not great Sonic games. Right after that, we get two games. We get Mario Power Tennis and Pikmin. Both are the new Play Control series versions of those. So these are both GameCube games that they just ported over to the Wii. They changed the controls so they work with the Wiimote now, and that's all they did. So they're worth mentioning because it's, a way that they tried to kind of put out games without necessarily remastering them or updating them at all, but let gamers have another crack at them, which in Pikmin's case is worth it, because if you didn't play Pikmin, well, you should play Pikmin. After that, we get to Mad World, which is super notable for being the first game by Platinum. Platinum was founded by members of the recently disbanded Clover Studios, who put out some amazing games in the PS2 and GameCube era. And this one is a crazy little, really stylish, violent game. You play Jack Kamen, who has a retractable chainsaw arm. He's sent into this, city that's been taken over by terrorists, where they're holding this Death Watch game, where you have to kill other people to stay alive and earn a vaccine to a virus. It's really twisted. There's all kinds of unique ways to set up traps for your opponents and kill them. It's got this really cool art style. It's all black and white, but blood is red. It's definitely something worth checking out, and it's really notable for being a good start to Platinum's legacy. Right after that, we have Rune Factory Frontier, which is the third game in the Rune Factory series, following Rune Factory 1 and 2 for the DS. Rune Factory is a spin-off of the Harvest Moon series. It's a fantasy version of Harvest Moon. So basically it takes place in this fantasy world where you're still doing farming and managing relationships, but you can also go into dungeons and defeat monsters and crawl through dungeons in order to complete objectives. This game takes place after Rune Factory 1 for the DS and features the same main character, so you're still controlling him. You head to a new town looking for a missing girl and get wrapped up in some of the crazy events happening there. At the time, a lot of those Harvest Moon style games were on portables only, so it was a great step to bring that stuff to consoles. Next up is kind of a personal pick for me. Broken Sword, Director's Cut, Shadow of the Templars. This is an update of the first Broken Sword game, which is a 2D point-and-click adventure. It's the series is pretty notable. I think they're on 5 now. It's just your classic point-and-click adventure. The game stars George Stobart, who is an American vacationing in Paris when he's sees a terrorist attack take place at a cafe, and he's being questioned by the police. He meets this journalist Nico. They work together and uncover this huge conspiracy. And it's your, like I said, it's your classical adventure game. The Wiimote really feels good for it, for most of it. There's a couple puzzles, like I think turning a safe dial at one point, which is frustrating. But other than that, the pointing and clicking works great with the Wiimote. There were some puzzles removed from the original games, but there was a bunch of puzzles added. You can also play as Nico now, so there's additional segments with her you get to play as. For fans of adventure games, it's definitely worth checking out. Next up, Final Fantasy, Crystal Chronicles, The Echoes of Time. This game is just so strange. It is a sequel to the DS game Ring of Fate. It also came out on the DS. This is less of a Wii port than like an emulated version of the DS game. It's really strange. You've got both screens from the DS on screen at the same time in this version. You switch between them, but because they're both on screen, they take up so little space. It's actually really cluttered. It's really hard to see what's going on in the game and read the text on screen. It's really strange. I can't get across how strange it is. One thing that's really notable about it is that Square created the Pollux engine to use for it, which allowed the Wii version to play multiplayer with the DS version. So Yeah, I don't think that thing was used anywhere else ever again. You'd think they could use it for Kingdom Hearts or something, but they didn't. And I'm guessing this did terribly because of how weird it is. Yeah, so like I said, it's interesting as part of the Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series, but definitely something that's a challenge to play. Next up, another game I don't have, but it's another in the new Play Control series. It is Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. The original Jungle Beat was a platformer game that you played with the bongos. It came with Donkey Konga on the GameCube. What makes this one really interesting is that they changed the controls to work as like a standard platformer. So you use the analog stick to move, you use A button to jump, but they also added several new stages, which is surprising because none of the other new Play Control games added anything. Next up is Klonoa, and it's one of the best platformers for the system that wasn't developed by Nintendo. It was created as a way to, revitalize the Klonoa series. It's a remake of the original Klonoa Door to Phantomville for PS1. It stays really true to that game, except that all the graphics have been updated. Everything has been rebuilt from the ground up. It's a cool little 2.5D platformer. It plays like a 2D platformer, but it's got levels where the camera swings around and it just works really well. It's also a really cool looking game. It uses a cel-shaded art style that looks really neat. And despite its really cutesy look, though, actually has a bit of a dark turn in the story, so it's something that is worth checking out if you're a fan of platformers. Next up is Punch-Out for the Wii, which is an update to, Nintendo's arcade Punch-Out, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out for the NES, and Super Punch-Out for the SNES. And it plays great. After the original Punch-Out, it may actually be my favorite Punch-Out game. It looks beautiful. It controls really well. 10 of the fighters from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out are back. 2 fighters from Super Punch-Out are in it. There's 3 new fighters, including Donkey Kong. One really interesting thing that they did with it is that you can use the balance board and the Wiimote and Nunchuck to kind of play it like a real boxing game. So it's a really neat control scheme that you don't see in anything else, and it just works. It works pretty well. Like, it's definitely worth checking out if you have this game, if you can get a Wii Fit board and try it out. It's something that works pretty well, and it's a cool little addition to the game. It's got a new split screen versus mode, so if you want to go head to head with a friend, you can do that now. It's definitely one of the best games on the system. Next up, we have Boom Blox Bash Party, which is a follow-up to Boom Blox that we talked about in last year's games. They changed the primary mechanic from shooting out your projectiles to kind of slingshotting them into the stage, which works quite a bit better. It adds a bit more strategy to the game. They added 400 new levels. There's DLC, so you could download levels at the time. You could also create and share your levels with other players, so there was a bunch of neat new stuff to it. Next up, I want to talk about Indiana Jones Staff of Kings. It's a follow-up to the other 3D Indiana Jones games, the PS2 game Emperor's Tomb and the N64 game Infernal Machine. This game also came out on PS2, but the Wii version is notable for a reason I'll get to in a bit. It's not a great game. It feels less like a adventure game than those other two. The stages feel kind of like the gameplay changes between stages, and it feels like your traditional Wii kind of mini game collection. Like, now you're in a shooting gallery, now you're in a brawler section, now you're in a platforming section. It's split up so specifically that it doesn't feel like a free-flowing adventure. The Wii version also contains a co-op mode that you can play with a friend. There's a couple new stages there, but again, it's the same kind of thing. It feels like mini games. What makes this game really special is that the Wii version comes with Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, which is a big LucasArts adventure game from back in the day. This is the only console version of it. It's on par with things like Maniac Mansion and Sam & Max. If you like 2D adventure games, then that's one you have to play, and this is definitely a cool way to play it. Next up, we're going to talk about Let's Tap, which is a game that is criminally unknown. The people that know it love it. The game really does what I think the Wii set out to do, which is to create unique gaming experience that anyone can enjoy that isn't your traditional kind of gaming. And this one uses the Wii mode in a way that nothing else has. There's 5 modes and you can play up to 4 players, but the gimmick here is that you lie your Wiimote flat on a table, and instead of interacting with the Wiimote directly, you tap the table to try and get the accelerometer in the Wiimote to register your movements. And that's kind of how you compete in different mini games. And it's just really cool for that. Again, it's a fun little game. It's something that's worth noting just because of that. Next up is another game. I don't think I've ever even seen it in the wild before, but I don't think it's that rare. I think I've seen it for pretty cheap online, and it's the Mad Dog McCree Gunslinger Pack. This thing is such a strange thing for the Wii, only because of how old the series is, but because it was all video, I guess it's easy to port over. If you don't know, the Mad Dog games are a series of Laserdisc games. They were light gun shooters that were set in the West, and they just had full motion video running behind them. So the original game was in arcades. I think it may have been the first Laserdisc shooting game. And this collection contains the original game, the follow-up Mad Dog 2, The Lost Gold, and The Last Bounty Hunter, which was created by the same company, but not necessarily part of the Mad Dog series. Next up is another game I don't have here, but it's Overlord Dark Legend. And this is a game that's a prequel to the Overlord games, which came out on Xbox 360 and PS3, which are a cool little take on Pikmin. Basically, you play this Overlord. He has a bunch of minions. You use those minions to defeat enemies and clear objectives. It's really fun. It's really funny. It's written by Rhianna Pratchett, who is Terry Pratchett's daughter, who is also a hilarious writer. So it's definitely worth checking out if you like the Overlord series. Next up is Resident Evil Archives. This is a port of the GameCube Resident Evil remake. They added a new control scheme so that you could use the Wiimotes. Other than that, there's nothing different. So it's notable because it's just like Nintendo's new Play Control series, but it's Capcom putting out Resident Evil games. Now that updates to this game have come out for PS4 and Xbox One, this isn't really anything worth checking out. It's just, worth noting. Another game I don't have here, but definitely worth mentioning for this system, is Little King's Story. It's this really cute adventure RTS game where you play this boy who has found a crown that lets him control other people, who can give orders to the different citizens in his town to kind of complete objectives. You go out, you gather resources, you use those to build new buildings and keep your townspeople happy. At the same time, you can go out adventuring and try to conquer the neighboring kingdoms. There's not really much to say about it. It's a really cute game. There's a great art style. It plays really well. It's really unique. I know it came out later for other things. I think this may be the only physical version of it. So, check it out. Now we get into the most notable hardware advancement for the Wii, which is the Wii Motion Plus. This thing was a little adapter that attached to the bottom of the Wiimote. Later on, it would be built into the Wiimotes, but for now, it had to be attached. This means all new, rubber guards for the Wiimotes had to come out. It was a pain. It made the Wiimote a little longer, but it really gave that one-to-one feel that people expected originally from the Wiimote. So now you could finally get experiences that really felt like the characters on screen were moving exactly as you were. This shipped alongside Wii Sports Resort, which was a great, follow-up to Wii Sports, although maybe a little too late. Wii Sports Resort had updated versions of bowling and golf from the original Wii Sports that took advantage of the Wii Motion Plus. It also had an updated version of table tennis from the Wii Play game. And it had 12 new mini games with stuff like archery and wakeboarding and parachuting, sword play, and other stuff like that. The new games were a little smaller than the original titles. They were, the game was themed around this resort, and so they were more smaller experiences, I would say, than your traditional sports games. But it was a cool little series of multiplayer games that people could play. Next up is Nissa's Phantom Brave, We Meet Again. This is an update of the PS2 game that came out 3 years ago. It's a tactics RPG. You play this 13-year-old girl whose parents have been killed, and she can see ghosts, and she can summon those phantoms to fight with her. So the whole point of the game is her to get revenge, to stop the evil that's, attacking the world, and to use these spirits to have these big strategic battles. The Wii version added a new game plus, and it added a second kind of mini campaign. So it's worth checking out if you like Phantom Brave. If you like NIS Tactics games, it's definitely something that you should check out. Next is one of the heavy hitters on the system, definitely one of the most sought after titles on the system, which is Metroid Prime Trilogy. So we talked about Metroid Prime 3 Corruption in the last video. Metroid Prime Trilogy takes that game, bundles it up with the previous two Metroid Prime games for GameCube. It gives those GameCube games the new play controls, so they control like Metroid Prime 3, which works really well. And bundles it up into this neat little collection where you can play all three Metroid Prime games. There's a new kind of gallery. You can unlock things by completing objectives in the different Metroid Prime games. One thing that's a little frustrating is that a lot of the good unlocks require this friend token system to be used, where you would send tokens back and forth between friends, and then you could use those to redeem items in the bonus section. The problem is now that the network is down, there's no way to do that. So the only way to get to see those bonus items is to download a save file from the internet, which is kind of a shame. But again, this game is a must-have for the system. The next game I want to talk about a bit is Cursed Mountain. It is a survival horror game that takes place on a Himalayan mountain. You go there in search of your lost brother, and there's all this Tibetan and Buddhist folklore. You're attacked by vengeful spirits of other climbers and monks. It's not a great game, but it was a good attempt to bring unique survival horror experiences to the Wii. The snowy environments really helped mask some of the system's downfalls and really created a unique atmosphere that other survival horror games didn't touch on. The climbing mechanics worked really well. You would have to upgrade your climbing equipment, and you'd have to manage your oxygen in order to get through the game. And it's just a cool little survival horror game worth noting. So we've gone through a bunch of Harvest Moon games for the Wii already, but this one is something that is really unique in that it is a port of a GameCube game that came out 3 years prior. They've updated the controls to work with the Wiimote, so now you can use motion controls for things like fishing and mining. But also they remove features, so unlike the GameCube version, you have to play as a boy character. You can't play as a female. It's just really strange. Between the time the GameCube version was released and this one was released, there were already other games that were released on Wii in the series. So I'd like to know really the rationale behind it. It could just be that I think in Europe they didn't get the GameCube version, so they released this instead, and they figured, well, why not put it out again on the Wii here so people who didn't have a GameCube can check it out. It's a strange oddity for the series. But like the GameCube version, everything is similar. You have to wake up the Harvest Goddess. You need to collect 50 musical notes to do that. You get notes from doing different objectives. You can collect up to 100 notes. And that's kind of the premise of the game. Next up is Vanillaware's Muramasa the Demon Blade. Vanillaware is known for games like Odin Sphere and Grim Grimoire. It's a 2D side-scrolling action RPG where you explore the world. You get into encounters that kind of lock you into an area until you defeat the enemies. The gameplay is really interesting. The way you kind of attack enemies using the controls is really different from other side-scrolling action RPGs. And it's got a beautiful hand-drawn world. It really takes Japanese folklore and historical stuff and works that into its storyline. You can play as a clan princess or a runaway ninja, both who are kind of fighting these demons back. There's 108 weapons in the game, so switching weapons is a big priority throughout the game. You can make new weapons. It's definitely one of the best games on the Wii. It was updated for PS Vita, so you can play that version instead. There's new stuff in that version, but I kind of prefer console releases. Next up is another game I don't really have anymore, but it is Dead Space Extraction. It is a really cool on-rails shooter that takes place in the Dead Space universe. I think it chronicles the events of before the first game. It's got some really good storytelling in it. It's got some really unique aspects for an on-rails shooter. You can use the kinesis power from the Dead Space series to grab objects and throw them at enemies to hurt them, to pick up items that are lying around. It's split up into 10 different chapters. It uses the same kind of gameplay mechanics as take off the enemy's limbs to kill them. An updated version was released with the PS3 version of Dead Space 2, which uses the PlayStation Move controllers, which again, like I said before, are a pain to set up. So I might try and pick up another copy of the Wii version so I can play that instead. But it's really unique as an original on-rail shooter for the Wii that tries to be something better than just an arcade shooter. It's definitely worth checking out. Next up, we have Wii Fit Plus, which is an update to the original Wii Fit. It's got all the activities from the original Wii Fit on there, as well as 15 new aerobics exercises, 3 bodybuilding exercises, and 3 yoga exercises. They've redesigned the menus to make it easier to move through, since that was a big complaint with the first game. If you've got the balance board and you were using Wii Fit, then this was a definite upgrade. It's neat to see that they try to keep supporting that, and they continue supporting that as well on the Wii U, so it's notable for that. Next up is A Boy and His Blob, which is an update of David Crane's NES game. It's a beautiful hand-drawn 2D adventure game, which, like the original NES game, this blob whose planet has been attacked comes to Earth and finds his little boy who's going to help him. And the boy can transform the blob into 15 different objects to help him get through the stages. So things like ladders, anvils to drop on enemies, holes he can fall through. It's a cool little puzzle game. It's got a really cutesy art style. You can scold the blob, you can hug him, you can do all kinds of like just little fun touches. It's definitely worth checking out. It came out later for download on other machines, but this is the only physical copy. Next up, I want to mention Ju-on the Grudge, the Haunted House Simulator, I think it's called, for the Wii. This thing is crazy that it came out. The American Grudge movie was out at this time, and because it was also set in Japan and used that same aesthetic, I feel like it also works really well as a Western release. They could just say, if you don't know the Ju-on series at all, well, this is just a Grudge game. Although it is a pretty bare bones game, it's really strange. It's not your traditional survival horror. That's why I guess they call it a haunted house simulator. You just kind of move through these environments, these haunted, whatever, factories, houses, whatever, and the ghosts from the Grudge series pop up and scare you on occasion, and you have to kind of get through each level. What makes it interesting is that there's a 2-player mode where the second player can kind of control the jump scares, so they can try and get the player one at different moments. So if you're playing in the dark with a buddy, it just adds a bit more meta to the game, which is interesting. Right after that, we have Mario and Sonic at the Winter Olympic Games, so a follow-up to the last Mario and Sonic Olympic Games. This one is set in Vancouver in 2010. It has 27 different events in it. It has this new festival mode where you can kind of go through all the events in order and see the opening and closing ceremonies. It has a couple co-op events, which is really neat. And some of the events use the Wii Fit balance board, so that's a neat little addition to the game. Right after that, we have Dragon Ball, The Revenge of King Piccolo, which is worth mentioning because it is a cool little Dragon Ball beat-em-up game. It's not your traditional fighting game, although there is a fighting mode in it. In this game, you basically just play as Goku from the original Dragon Ball series. You go through the Red Ribbon Saga and the King Piccolo sagas, and it's just a fun little beat-em-up adventure game. It's definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of Dragon Ball. Maybe one of my favorite Dragon Ball games, and it's a nice departure from all the Dragon Ball fighting games. Right after that, we have Drawn to Life, the next chapter. This is really interesting because the Drawn to Life series had been coming out on the DS, and it was a series where you drew your own hero, you drew his weapons, you drew platforms, and you tried to make it through the game by drawing things, basically, which works really well for a stylus-based system. So they decided to try and do that on the Wii, except in this case, they didn't port the DS game of the same name. They instead just made a whole new game. So I guess you kind of need to do that if you're using the Wii mode instead of a stylus. You'd think they would call it something different because that would be pretty confusing. But nope. So if you're a fan of the Drawn to Life series and didn't know that the Wii version was completely different, then it might be worth checking out. Right after that, we have Rabbids Go Home. And this is a game that I personally love. I'm not a huge fan of any of the other 3 Rabbids games that came out before this one. The first Rabbids game was a really cool multiplayer thing, but after that, its appeal wore off and the minigame collection stuff didn't do it for me. But this is a really cool, almost Katamari-like take on Rabbids. Basically, in this game, the Rabbids decide they want to go to the moon, and to get there, they decide to build a huge pile full of stuff to climb. So you get a shopping cart, you control the Rabbids, you go to different stages, and you just load up your shopping cart with all the items in the stage you can find. Like I said, it's just like Katamari. You roll through the levels, you pick up things, and you get to the end of the level, and then it adds to your pile. There's 30 different stages, so there's quite a bit there, and it's just a fun little funny game. Next up, we have another Harvest Moon. It's actually amazing how many Harvest Moons came out for the Wii. This one is Animal Parade, and it's a sequel to Tree of Tranquility. So it uses a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same animals and gameplay. The one thing that's unique here is they did add a bunch of circus animals. The premise behind the game is that all the animals are leaving the island because the Harvest King has disappeared. So you're trying to ring bells, complete objectives to ring bells, and get the Harvest King to come back. The only other really notable thing about it is that you can have 2 kids now. So for a long time, the limitation was 1 kid in your family that you could have and assign chores to. In this case, now you get 2. Right after that, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, coming off the success of the DS New Super Mario Bros. This is probably the most popular of the New Super Mario Bros. Games. It's the one that introduced the 4-player co-op, so you play as Mario, Luigi, and 2 Toads. You get in each other's way, which can be really frustrating, but also really fun. Because 2 players can't occupy the same space at the same time, you're pushing each other when it comes to tiny platforms and managing how you move through the level. It can be difficult, but it's also a ton of fun. This game is really inspired by Super Mario Bros. 3, so it uses a lot of similar level design to that. Whereas, the original game was inspired by the original Super Mario Bros. And the Wii U game is inspired by Super Mario World. It's your typical 2D Mario game with just great design levels, fun co-op, and it's one of the games on the system that you definitely need to have. Next up is Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, which is a follow-up to the Umbrella Chronicles. This time the game covers Resident Evil 2, 3, and Code Veronica. Because Resident Evil 2 and 3 are PS1 games that never had an update, they use assets from the Resident Evil Outbreak games for PS2. So the stages don't quite feel like they come straight from Resident Evil 2 and 3. There's a lot of environments you might not notice, but that's not really the main draw to this game anyway. The main draw is the new Leon campaigns, which feature Leon and Jack and were a prequel to Resident Evil 4, which everyone loved. So it was neat to see those characters a bit more, have their story fleshed out a bit more. And, these games, aside from some frustrating QuickTime events, are really good on-rail shooters. So it's worth checking out if you're a fan of the Resident Evil series anyway. Next up is the Resident Evil Zero version of the Resident Evil Archive series. Just like the other game we talked about in this video, there's nothing really new here other than the control schemes. It's just a port of the GameCube game, which has now been ported to newer systems. So, alright. Now we're getting to our last 2 games for this really long year. Silent Hill Shattered Memories first came out for the Wii. Later was ported to the PS2 and PSP, but the Wii is still by far the best experience. The controls work really well on it. The game was a real surprise when it came out. At this point, the Silent Hill series wasn't being well received. The original Team Silent had been disbanded, and the studios who were coming in to make the games like Origins had a lot of problems with it. So Shattered Memories was announced as a remake of or rather a reimagining of the original Silent Hill 1. It still featured Harry trying to find his daughter in Silent Hill, although this time things were really different. Silent Hill itself was a regular populated town. It wasn't this weird, destroyed city that no one lived in anymore. It also, instead of having this like grady, dark, alternate world, it had this icy one. The gameplay was changed so that when you were in Silent Hill regular, it was more of an adventure. You're just going around exploring. When you were in the icy world, that was the only time monsters ever came out and could attack you. It had a really interesting psychological system where you would undergo these tests at a psychiatrist's office basically and answer different questions, and then it would take that information and work it back into the game and try and tailor the game world to be something that would be creepier to you or something that just be a little more personal to you. And it did it in some really interesting ways. Even if you're not a fan of Silent Hill, it's something that's worth checking out. It is not a horror game, it's more of a thriller. The story has a really cool arc and a real neat storytelling device that make it worth checking out. So even though it's not a great Silent Hill game per se, it's a really cool thriller. Last up is Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles: The Crystal Bearers. This is a game that's real surprising to me because the Crystal Chronicle series has been all over the place. From the weird original GameCube one where you have to carry this thing around the whole time with you, to these weird DS ones and that weird one we talked about earlier, and some cool little download ones. But this one finally put some production value behind this series, although it does it in a really strange way. Instead of making an action RPG, this is this weird action adventure game. It's got platforming and shooting segments, and it's got a little bit of open world exploration, but it really feels like an action game, and the kind of different gameplay stuff really feels like your traditional Wii. Here's your different stages, kind of like mini game collection that gets wrapped up in a coherent story. But like I said, there's some nice production value behind it. There's a real cool story there. There's a bunch of fun little mini games and a cool world to explore. And it still ties into the original series in an interesting way. So it takes place 1,000 years after the original Crystal Chronicles. It seems to follow some of the events from Ring of Fate. It takes place in this world where magic is banned, and some people are being born who are called Crystal Bearers, who have, you know, some power within them. So obviously they fight back against some evil. It is a game that no one really played when it came out. Final Fantasy fans kind of avoided it, but I think it's worth checking out. It's really unique. It is fun. Don't expect a full Final Fantasy experience from it, but expect something different and interesting. And that wraps up 2009. Our biggest year. So, I hope you learned about a bunch of games. Maybe you didn't know about some of them before. Again, these are my personal recommendations. I went through everything that came out, and these are the ones that stood out to me. If something came out in this time period that, you know, was incredible that I didn't know about, then come on, let me know. I'd like to hear about other cool things too. So our next video will be the last one for North American releases. We're going to cover basically everything from 2010 onward. Thanks for checking that out. We have a Wii U video if you didn't see that one. That was the one that kind of kicked off this whole process. Yeah, so you can check that one out to see all of the Wii U games I recommend. And we're going to get to other systems like 3DS and DS and other things sometime soon. You know, this series has been doing pretty well, so we're probably just going to keep going this way. Thanks a lot. See you next time.